What happens to a country when the lights start going out, one power plant at a time?
Iran is finding out right now, and what Trump just did to their grid might change everything that happens next. Before we go further, hit that like button, tap subscribe, and send this to one person who still thinks this war is only about missiles. Because it is not. It is about power, literal power. Let's start with the basics. For years, Iran built its strength around three things: nuclear ambition, a network of proxy fighters across the Middle East, and control over one of the most important waterways
on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow stretch of water carries roughly a quarter of the world's oil and gas. Whoever controls it can squeeze the global economy just by threatening to close it. Iran knew this. For decades, Iranian leaders treated the strait like a loaded gun they kept pointed at the world. Not fired often, but always visible, always a threat sitting in the background of every negotiation. Then came Operation Epic Fury. American and Allied forces struck Iran's nuclear sites hard, setting the program back by what experts now describe as decades, not years. After that strike, there was a brief window where diplomacy looked possible. A memorandum of understanding was signed. Iran agreed to stop firing on commercial ships moving through the Strait of Hormuz. In exchange, the United States opened the door to broader talks about sanctions relief and a long-term deal. For a moment, it looked like the story might end quietly. Oil prices started falling. Tankers began moving again. The world took a breath. But inside Iran, something else was happening. Hardliners in the regime watched oil flow freely through the strait and panicked.
To them, every barrel of oil moving safely through that water was a barrel of leverage disappearing. Their nuclear program was gone. Their proxy network was weakened. The strait was the last card they had left to play. And they watched Trump's diplomatic opening quietly take that card out of their hands. So they broke the agreement. Iran fired on ships again. Missiles and drones launched, not just near the strait, but stretching outward to hit Qatar, Bahrain, and Jordan.
A power and water desalination plant in Kuwait, a nation that depends on that kind of infrastructure
to survive in the desert, was damaged in the process. This was not a country defending itself. This was a country trying to prove it could still hurt others, even after losing its biggest weapon. And that is where everything shifted. The United States responded, but not in the way people expected. Instead of another wave of headline-grabbing strikes on famous targets, the war planners changed the entire approach.
They went after something quieter, and in many ways, far more devastating. The infrastructure
that keeps a modern war machine running. Roads, bridges, power stations, all near the port city of Bandar Abbas, the single most important location Iran has for controlling the Strait of Hormuz. Think about what that means for a moment. Bandar Abbas is not just a city. It is the nerve center. It is where supplies move in and out for the Revolutionary Guard forces stationed along the coast. It is where fuel, weapons, and reinforcements travel through to reach the units capable of threatening ships in the strait. Cut the roads, destroy the bridges, and suddenly that entire military presence is isolated, cut off from resupply, sitting there with whatever it already has and nothing more coming in. That is exactly what happened. Strike after strike hit the roads and bridges surrounding Bandar Abbas until the Revolutionary Guard's supply lines were essentially severed. Oil tankers that once needed only hours to move through the region were suddenly backed up, stuck, unable to cross, because the bridges that once carried them simply were not there anymore. But the roads and bridges were only the beginning. Reports coming out of Iran describe something even more striking. Nearly 2,000 targets were hit across Iran's state-run electrical grid in just a few days. Iran's own energy minister went on state media and asked citizens to reduce their electricity use. Think about that. A government that spent years threatening the world's oil supply was now asking its own people to use less power because its own grid was buckling under pressure. This is the moment. The title of this video is talking about the power grid Iran desperately needed to keep its military machine running, to keep its cities functioning, to keep the illusion of strength alive, was being taken apart piece by piece. Not with a single dramatic explosion, but with a slow, methodical campaign that left almost no part of the system untouched. Picture the scale of that for a second. Nearly 2,000 separate targets. Not one power plant, not one substation. A web of infrastructure spread across an entire country, hit again and again until the strain became impossible to hide. When a government has to go on state television and ask ordinary citizens to switch off appliances and cut back on power, that is not a small inconvenience. That is a sign the system is buckling from the inside, right at the moment it needed to look strongest. Consider also the timing of all this. This did not happen at some random point in the conflict. It happened right after Iran violated an agreement it had personally signed, an agreement that simply asked it to stop firing on commercial vessels. That single broken promise is what unlocked this entire phase of the campaign. It is worth remembering that every escalation the United States has carried out since then has come as a direct response to something Iran did first, not the other way around. Why does this matter so much more than another missile strike would? Because a missile strike is dramatic, but it is temporary. You lose a building, you lose a weapon depot, and eventually you rebuild. A crippled power grid is different. It touches everything. Hospitals need power. Water treatment needs power. Military communication needs power. Command centers need power. Manufacturing needs power. When you take out the grid, you are not just hitting one target. You are quietly weakening every single system connected to it, all at once, all the time, every hour of every day until it is repaired. And bridges work the same way, just for movement instead of electricity. Every truck of fuel, every convoy of weapons, every reinforcement heading toward the coast has to cross something to get there. Take away the crossing points, and it does not matter how many weapons a country still has stored somewhere inland. If those weapons cannot reach the coast, they cannot be used. There is a simple way to picture this. Imagine a house with the water shut off at the main valve. It does not matter how many taps you have inside, how nice the kitchen is, how modern the bathroom looks. If the main valve is closed, none of it works. Bandar Abbas was Iran's main valve for controlling the Strait of Hormuz. Cut the roads and bridges feeding it, and every asset behind that valve becomes useless, no matter how powerful it looks on paper. This is the strategy behind what is now being called Project Freedom, a plan first discussed months earlier with one clear goal: secure the Strait of Hormuz, clear it of threats, and protect the ships moving through it. The plan always included isolating Bandar Abbas by taking out the very infrastructure that allowed Iran to resupply and rearm along that coastline. What we are watching now is that plan finally being carried out in full after an earlier attempt was interrupted and delayed. So here's the picture forming. Iran's nuclear program badly damaged. Iran's proxy network weakened. Iran's coastal military presence around the strait cut off from supply, thanks to destroyed roads and bridges. And now Iran's own power grid, struggling to keep the lights on for its own citizens. What does a regime do when every major source of leverage disappears at the same time? That question is exactly why tensions are still so high right now, even with all of this pressure. And that brings us to the response. We're moving deep into how this could unfold from here, so if you have not already, now is a good moment to subscribe. Not just for this video, but so you do not miss what comes next. In this story, because it is changing fast, Iranian officials have publicly said they still want to deal with the United States. That sounds promising on the surface. But inside Iran's own government, there is a clear divide. On one side are the pragmatists, the ones who understand that continuing this conflict only leads to more destroyed infrastructure and more economic pain. On the other side are the hardliners, the ones who still control the military, who see any concession as giving up the last shred of power they have left. This divide explains the pattern we keep seeing. Talks happen, some progress gets made, then a handful of attacks occur, seemingly against the wishes of the more moderate voices in the government. The United States responds with force. And then, strangely, Iran comes back to the table again, at least for a while before the cycle repeats. Think of it like two drivers fighting over the same steering wheel while the car is moving. One side wants to slow down and find a safer road. The other keeps yanking the wheel back toward danger. Every time that happens, the car swerves, something gets damaged, and then for a moment the calmer driver regains control again, until the next yank. That is essentially what is happening inside Iran's own government right now, and every swerve costs the country more infrastructure, more leverage, and more credibility on the world stage. It is messy. It does not look like a clean victory or a clean resolution, but messy is not the same as failing. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. Before any of this escalation happened, people confidently predicted disaster for the global economy. Oil prices were going to skyrocket, past $100, $200, even $300 a barrel, according to some of the loudest voices. None of that happened. In fact, oil prices during this period have stayed lower than they were at points before this conflict even started. That is not what a collapsing global energy market looks like. Why? Because even with fighting still happening, tankers are still moving. Not at full pre-war volume, but enough to keep the world from tipping into a full-blown energy crisis. 3 days without a single ship being hit in the strait. More than a dozen tankers passing through, safely in a single day. These are not signs of a region falling apart. These are signs of a strategy working, slowly, carefully, and not without cost, but working. Now, some critics argue this is not enough. They want a guarantee, an absolute promise that no ship will ever be threatened again, that Iran's military capability will never again pose any risk to shipping in that region. It is an understandable demand emotionally, but practically, it sets a standard that no military action in history could ever meet. And this is where the loudest voices tend to get it wrong. Some of them are not actually arguing in good faith. They want to see failure, not because they have a better plan, but because they would rather watch a president stumble than admit a difficult strategy might be working. Ask them directly what they would do differently, and the answers get vague fast. Nobody offers a real alternative. They just move the goalposts over and over until no outcome would ever satisfy them. Think about it this way. If one person with a small amount of money can buy cheap drones on the black market and fire them at a ship from some remote patch of coastline, no amount of bombing bridges or destroying power stations will completely eliminate that risk. What destroying the infrastructure does is remove the ability to do this in an organized, sustained, government-backed way. It does not erase every possible bad actor on Earth. Nothing could. So the real question is not whether the threat has been reduced to zero. It is whether the threat has been reduced enough that global oil and gas can flow safely, that shipping companies feel confident sending their vessels through, and that Iran's ability to wage a serious, coordinated campaign against international trade has been crippled rather than merely dented. By that measure, something significant has clearly happened here. Iran's nuclear capability has been set back by what some experts describe as decades. Its military infrastructure around the coast has been isolated. Its power grid has taken damage severe enough that its own government is asking citizens to cut back on electricity. And its bridges, the physical connective tissue linking supply to the front lines, have been reduced to rubble in key locations. This is not the kind of damage that gets undone in a few weeks. Power grids take time to rebuild. Bridges take time to rebuild. And in the meantime, every day that passes without those repairs is another day Iran's military along the coast operates with less fuel, fewer supplies, and weaker coordination than before. To understand just how deep this goes, think about what a modern military actually needs to function. It needs radar systems running around the clock. It needs command centers that can talk to units in the field without delay. It needs fuel depots connected to the front by usable roads. It needs workshops that can repair damaged equipment, and those workshops need electricity to run their tools. Take away consistent power, and every one of these functions slows down. Communication becomes patchy. Repairs take longer. Coordination between units breaks apart. A military does not need to lose a single soldier to become weaker. It just needs to lose the systems that let it act like one unified force instead of scattered, isolated pieces. That is what makes this campaign so different from a typical bombing run. Missiles hitting a weapons depot make for dramatic footage. But a damaged power grid works in the background, hour after hour, day after day, wearing down a country's ability to respond to anything at all. It is the kind of pressure that does not show up as a single headline. It shows up as delays, as shortages, as confusion inside a command structure that suddenly cannot rely on the basics it always took for granted. There is also a psychological layer to all of this that is easy to overlook. For years, the Strait of Hormuz gave Iran something more valuable than any single weapon: the ability to make the entire world nervous just by existing near that waterway. Every time oil prices ticked up because of regional tension, it reinforced the idea that Iran held real power over the global economy. That kind of leverage does not just disappear because a treaty gets signed. It disappears when the physical ability to act on that threat gets destroyed. And that is precisely what has been happening. Not through a single dramatic knockout blow, but through a grinding, methodical campaign against roads, bridges, and power stations that quietly strips away the machinery needed to make that old threat credible again. Consider what this means for ordinary people inside Iran, too. It is easy to talk about strategy and leverage and geopolitics, but somewhere in Bandar Abbas right now, there are families dealing with rolling blackouts. There are workers who cannot get fuel because the roads leading to their city have been destroyed. There are hospitals trying to keep equipment running on a grid that is under constant strain. War, even one framed around missiles and military targets, always eventually becomes a story about ordinary lives disrupted by decisions made far above their control. None of this happened because ordinary Iranians wanted conflict. It happened because a small circle of hardliners decided that keeping a chokehold on global shipping was worth more than the safety and stability of their own people. That is the part often missing from the loud arguments online. The pressure campaign is not aimed at punishing a nation for existing. It is aimed at removing the tools a specific group of decision makers has used to threaten the rest of the world, even as the cost of that decision falls hardest on the people who never got a vote in the matter. This is also why the diplomatic side of this story matters so much, even in the middle of all this destruction. The vice president has been clear that expecting a 100% guarantee of permanent peace is not realistic. What is realistic is pushing an aggressive, unpredictable regime toward a position where continuing to fight costs it more than continuing to talk. That is the entire logic behind combining military pressure with an open door to negotiation. Hit the infrastructure that enables aggression, keep the offer of a deal on the table. Let the internal pressure inside Iran's own government do the rest. It is a strategy built on patience. even when the headlines make it look chaotic. Strikes happen, a ship gets hit. The world assumes everything is falling apart. Then talks resume. Then it repeats. From the outside, this can look like failure. From the inside, it looks like a slow, deliberate squeeze, one that removes options from the regime a little more each time a cycle plays out. We're getting close to the most important part of this story, the part that decides where all of this goes next. If this kind of breakdown actually helps you understand what is happening in the region, do something different this time. Do not just like this video. Comment one word that describes how you think this ends, and let's see what most people are predicting. So where does this actually leave Iran? A country that once held enormous leverage through its nuclear ambitions now has a program that has been set back by decades. A country that once relied on a wide network of armed proxies now watches those proxies weakened and stretched thin. A country that once threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz at will now cannot even guarantee safe passage of its own ships along its own coastline because the roads and bridges connecting its military to that coast have been destroyed. Compare this moment to where things stood only a year or two earlier. Back then, Iran could rattle the entire global oil market with a single statement about the Strait of Hormuz. Traders would react, prices would jump, analysts on every major network would spend the evening explaining what a closure would mean for gas prices back home. That kind of influence took decades to build, and it rested almost entirely on the assumption that Iran's threats were backed by real capability. Once that capability gets dismantled, piece by piece, the threats stop landing the way they used to. Markets stop flinching. Traders start looking past the noise because they know the muscle behind it has been cut down to a fraction of what it once was. That shift matters far beyond this one conflict. It changes how every future negotiation goes. It changes how much weight Iran's word carries at any future table. It changes how the rest of the region, from the Gulf states watching closely to shipping companies planning their routes for years ahead, calculates risk. Once the world stops being afraid of a threat, that threat loses almost all of its value, even if the country making it still exists exactly as it did before. And now, on top of all of that, the very power grid keeping the country running, the system Iran desperately needed to hold everything together, fuel production, water systems, military coordination, communication, all of it, has taken damage severe enough that officials are publicly asking citizens to use less electricity. This is not a country negotiating from a position of strength. This is a country negotiating because its options have been stripped away one infrastructure target at a time. The hardliners inside Iran's government understand this better than anyone. That is exactly why they keep pushing back against any lasting agreement. Every time oil flows freely through the strait, every time a deal moves forward, they lose a little more of the leverage that used to make them feel untouchable. So they push their military to act, hoping a handful of attacks will remind the world that Iran still has teeth. But teeth without supply lines do not last long. And that is the story unfolding right now, quietly, away from the loudest headlines. Not a single dramatic ending, but a slow dismantling of the very systems Iran needed to remain a threat. Whatever happens next, whether the pragmatists eventually win out inside Iran's government, or the hardliners keep pulling the country back toward conflict, one thing has already changed permanently. The power Iran once held over the world, through fear, through the threat of a closed strait, through the shadow of a nuclear weapon, has been taken apart, piece by piece, bridge by bridge, power station by power station. And once that kind of power is gone, it does not come back with a single ceasefire or a single signature on a piece of paper. It comes back only if the infrastructure comes back first. Until then, every blackout in Bandar Abbas, every broken bridge along that coastline, is a quiet reminder of exactly how much has already been lost. The lights are going out in the places that mattered most to this regime's power. And for the first time in a long time, Iran does not get to decide when they come back on. Every war of this kind eventually gets remembered by one image. Sometimes it is a battlefield, sometimes it is a treaty signed on camera. This one may end up being remembered as something quieter than that. A dark city near a coastline that used to hold the whole world hostage with a single threat. A bridge that no longer exists, sitting where it once carried the fuel and firepower a regime needed to feel untouchable. Power, in the end, is rarely lost. In one moment. It is lost the same way it is built, piece by piece, until one day the country that used to make the world nervous is the one asking its own people to turn off the lights. If this story helped you see the bigger picture behind the headlines, make sure you are subscribed, drop your thoughts in the comments, and share this with someone who still thinks this conflict is only about missiles and negotiations. It is about power, in every sense of the word. And right now, Iran is running out of it.